Late on the night before March 1st, 1943, a Japanese convoy slipped out of Rabaul and turned toward New Guinea. 8 transports and cargo ships, 8 destroyers, nearly 7,000 soldiers. On the chart, the destination was Leh. In the minds of the men who planned the voyage, the destination was something darker. A test of whether Japan could still move an army by sea in daylight under Allied air power and survive. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura had been given the job of shepherding the convoy through the Bismarck Sea. He knew the route was dangerous. Everyone in Rabaul knew it. The Americans and Australians had been building up airfields, training strike crews, and reading enough signals traffic to know that a major reinforcement run was coming. The Japanese staff had already accepted that losses were likely. Not possible. Likely. The gamble was that enough ships would get through to keep Leh alive. But the planners had made one fatal assumption. They believed the danger would come from above. They were wrong. The thing that would destroy the convoy was not a larger bomber. It was not a new torpedo. It was not a secret battleship waiting over the horizon. It was an angle, 4 degrees above the water, low enough to throw spray from the propellers, low enough to vanish beneath the habits of lookouts and gunners, low enough that the heavy anti-aircraft guns on the ships could not depress far enough to meet it. The convoy was not simply attacked. It was forced to fight a war its weapons had not been built to see. And the man who helped make that possible was not an admiral. He was a stubborn, profane, middle-aged mechanic from Arkansas and New Mexico by reputation, a former Navy aviator named Pappy Gunn, whose wife and children were trapped in Manila behind Japanese wire. By early 1943, the Southwest Pacific was a map of places Japan could no longer afford to lose. Guadalcanal was gone. The old offensive momentum had broken. In New Guinea, the Japanese line leaned heavily on Leh, a base on the northeast coast that fed men, fuel, ammunition, and aircraft into the Huon Peninsula. Leh was not a decorative dot on the map. It was a hinge. If Leh held, Japanese troops in New Guinea still had a forward base close enough to matter. If Leh failed, the line would begin folding back toward positions that were farther from the fight, harder to supply, and less useful every week. The men already in the forward areas were wearing down. Tropical disease did not care about bravery. Ammunition did not appear because a colonel demanded it. Food did not cross hundreds of miles of dangerous water by wish power. Small craft and submarines could sneak supplies in. They could not feed an army. So the 51st Division was loaded aboard transports at Rabaul. Soldiers packed into holds, equipment lashed down. Officers told just enough to understand the urgency, but not enough to feel the full weight of the wager. The convoy had to go. And that is the trap in this story. The Japanese did not sail because they believed the Bismarck Sea was safe. They sailed because every other choice looked worse. Across the water, the Allies understood something similar from the opposite side. If the convoy reached Leh, the New Guinea campaign would get harder. Japanese resistance would thicken. The next Australian advance would cost more. The next airfield would be harder to take. The next valley would contain men who had arrived because someone failed to stop them at sea. So stopping the convoy mattered. But the old methods were not enough. High-altitude bombing against ships at sea looked powerful from the air and disappointing on the damage reports. A ship under attack had time to turn. A bomb dropped from thousands of feet might land close, throw water up the side, and still leave the vessel afloat. Torpedo runs were worse. Low, straight, predictable approaches into fighter cover and anti-aircraft fire. Brave men flew them. too many did not come home. The Japanese had studied that kind of attack. Their escorts were prepared for it. Their ships expected aircraft to come from the sky. Paul Gunn looked at the problem differently. He did not begin with doctrine. He began with metal. Gunn had been a Navy flyer before the war, then an airline man in the Philippines. When Japanese forces took Manila, his family was interned there. He escaped into the war carrying a private urgency that no staff paper could measure. He was not patient with methods that looked correct and failed in practice. To him, the B-25 Mitchell was not a sacred design. It was a machine. If a machine did not do the job, you cut into it until it did. The standard B-25 was a medium bomber. It had a bombardier position in the nose, defensive guns, and a bomb bay designed around normal assumptions. Normal assumptions were the problem. Gunn wanted the plane to stop behaving like a bomber before the enemy had time to treat it like one. Strip out the nose. Mount forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Add more guns along the sides. Point the whole aircraft like a weapon. Not dive from altitude. Not glide into a torpedo run. Come in flat, fast, and low, straight across the face of the sea. The forward guns would rake the bridge, gun crews, and exposed decks. Then the aircraft would release bombs at mast height. Time to skip across the surface like stones, slam into the hull, and explode where water mattered most. Below the line where panic could be solved by courage. Below the line where damage control had time. This was not just a change in equipment, it was a change in the geometry of the fight. A ship designed to shoot upward could be made helpless by an aircraft that refused to arrive from upward. That insight sounds obvious after the fact. Before the fact, it sounded reckless. The crews would have to fly at wave-top height. One mistake could put a wingtip into the sea. One late pullout could make the aircraft part of the explosion it had caused. One misjudged approach could send a medium bomber straight into a wall of steel. Senior officers had reasons to hesitate. They had manuals. They had losses. They had the institutional memory of what happened when aircraft flew low and straight at armed ships. Gunn had numbers from practice runs. He had hit rates that made the old bombing tables look like superstition. And he had a private clock running inside him. His family was still in Manila. The war had to be shortened by something that worked. By February 1943, the modified aircraft were no longer just an idea. Crews were training. Armorers were improvising. Mechanics were fabricating mounts that had no polite place in the official manuals. Low-level runs were practiced over water until the timing became physical memory. The Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighter crews also had a role. The Beaufighters were not there to make the attack look dramatic. They were there to blind the convoy at the exact moment it needed to see. Fast, heavily armed, low over the water, they would come in ahead of the B-25s and slash at bridges, gun positions, and decks with cannon fire. They would pull the Japanese response sideways, downward, into confusion. Then the B-25s would arrive, not as an afterthought, as the hammer. This was the system the Japanese were about to meet, a high-altitude threat to pull eyes upward, low-level Beaufighters to tear open the defense, mast-height B-25s to put bombs into the hulls, fighters above to interfere with Japanese air cover, reconnaissance and signals intelligence tying the whole thing to the convoy's actual position. The convoy was not being hunted by one tactic. It was being placed inside a sequence. And sequence is what makes a weapon feel like weather. The first blows came on March 2nd, after the convoy had been spotted and fixed. Bombers hit one transport, Kyokusei Maru. Survivors were taken off. The convoy kept moving. That mattered. Because after March 2nd, The Japanese could still believe the original calculation might hold. One ship lost, the rest still moving, lay still ahead. The sea route had not yet collapsed. Then the morning of March 3rd opened clear. Wind over open water, then rising aircraft engines far away. The convoy entered the Huon Gulf with its destination no longer theoretical. New Guinea was close enough to feel like a promise. Men below decks may have believed the worst was behind them. On the bridge, officers watched the sky. At roughly mid-morning, high-altitude bombers appeared. This was the familiar danger. Japanese gunners reacted as they had been trained to react. Ships began maneuvering. Fire was directed upward. Fighter cover moved against the threat it understood. And while that was happening, the real attack crossed the water at sea level. 13 RAAF Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron came in so low that the convoy had almost no time to read them correctly. At first, the approach could be mistaken for a torpedo profile. That mistake mattered. Ships turned to meet what they thought was coming, narrowing their target profile against torpedoes and exposing exactly what the Beaufighters needed to punish. At close range, the Beaufighters opened fire. Bridges, gun mounts, deck crews, communication points. The convoy's defensive brain was being struck before the body could respond. It was brutal, precise work. Not random strafing, not cinematic chaos. The purpose was to remove seconds from the Japanese reaction. And seconds were the currency of the whole battle, because the B-25s were already coming. The modified Mitchells came in at mast height, big aircraft, too low, too fast, moving in the one slice of space the convoy's heavy guns could not properly own. Their forward .50 caliber guns fired as the pilots aimed the entire plane. This is the part of the story that makes the battle feel almost mechanical. The Japanese crews were not cowards. They were not asleep. They were not unaware that low-level attack was a growing problem. They were trapped inside the design limits of the equipment and doctrine they had. By the time a gun crew understood which direction death was coming from, the attacking aircraft had already crossed the last 1,000 yards. By the time the bridge tried to maneuver, rounds had already struck the men who gave the orders. By the time the bomb splashed down, it was no longer falling. It was moving horizontally, skipping. A bomb dropped from high altitude argues with probability. A skip bomb at mast height argues with the side of a ship. The first bounce put it on the water. The second movement put it into steel. The delayed fuse gave it just enough time to bite where flooding could do the most damage. Below the waterline, courage has no angle. The destroyer Shirayuki was hit and wrecked. Kimura himself was wounded. Other escorts were struck, disabled, burning, colliding, losing the ability to protect anything around them. Transports carrying men and equipment were opened in minutes. A convoy is supposed to multiply protection. Ships overlap fields of fire. Escorts shield transports. Fighter cover adds a ceiling. But when the attack arrives from incompatible directions at once, a convoy can multiply confusion instead. The B-17s and other aircraft kept pressure from above. The Beaufighters had torn into gun positions. The B-25s drove in at mast height. A 20s and additional strike aircraft joined the work. The Japanese formation began to lose its shape. Once a convoy loses shape under air attack, the sea itself becomes part of the enemy. A burning ship blocks the next ship. A wounded destroyer collides with the vessel it meant to protect. Oil spreads. Men jump into water that is no longer just water. By the time the main attack passed, the reinforcement mission was no longer a mission. It was wreckage. Ships burned across the Huon Gulf. Transports settled by the bow or rolled under. Destroyers that had been built to guard the convoy were gone or dying. Thousands of Japanese soldiers never reached Leh. The staff calculation that had sent them to sea had assumed that losses could be endured. It had not assumed the route itself would become impossible. That is the difference between defeat and revelation. A defeat tells you that one attempt failed. A revelation tells you the method is dead. After the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese could no longer treat large daylight surface convoy operations in that part of New Guinea as a normal risk. The loss was too complete. The system had been exposed too clearly. The question was no longer, how many ships will get through? The question was, can any convoy like this survive under Allied air cover? And the answer was moving across the Pacific in the shape of a modified B-25. Paul Gunn did not receive that news like a man whose life had become simple. His aircraft modifications helped change the air war in the Southwest Pacific. His reputation grew. General George Kenny valued him enormously. Gunn kept working on aircraft, weapons, field fixes, and anything else that might make Allied air power more lethal. But every success carried the same unanswered fact. His family was still imprisoned in Manila. That is what keeps his story from becoming a clean inventor's legend. It was not a tale of one clever man making one clever machine, then standing back while history applauded. It was a man taking apart aircraft because the war had entered his house. His wife and children were not symbols to him. They were people, names, voices, empty places in every hour he was awake. When he looked at a bomber that could not hit ships, he did not see an engineering inconvenience. He saw time. Time the war still had. Time his family did not have to spare. Time being lost because correct doctrine was failing politely. So he stopped being polite with the machine. The irony is that the most important object in this story did not survive as a monument. The modified aircraft, the welded mounts, the field changes that made the attack possible. Much of that work disappeared into wartime use, maintenance, conversion, and scrap. The idea survived better than the metal. That is common in war. A thing changes history, then becomes inventory. A piece of equipment proves a principle, then is reassigned. A mechanic solves a problem no committee had solved, then another form requires another signature. But the principle could not be scrapped. If a defense is built around one expected angle, change the angle. If an institution has mistaken habit for truth, make the truth physical enough that it cannot be ignored. If the gun will not depress, do not ask the gun for permission. Come in lower. The Bismarck Sea was not won only by bravery, though there was plenty of it. It was not won only by intelligence, though code-breaking and reconnaissance mattered. It was not won only by aircraft, though aircraft delivered the killing blow. It was won because someone saw that the enemy's protection had a shape, and shapes have edges. The Japanese convoy sailed because Leh needed men. It sailed because the staff believed enough ships could survive. It sailed because the alternative looked like strategic collapse. Then the Allied strike force arrived from above, from the side, and from the one narrow band of air the convoy had not been built to answer. The result was not a normal battle at sea. It was a demonstration that the old surface route to Leh had been broken. In February, a convoy could still look like a solution. By the afternoon of March 3rd, it looked like a memory. Paul Gunn lived long enough to see his family liberated from Santo Tomas in 1945. He went back to the Philippines after the war. He kept flying. In 1957, he died in a crash over the country that had held everything he was trying to get back. That ending feels too rough for a story about invention. Maybe that is why it should be kept rough. War does not always preserve the people who solve its problems. It does not always label the scraps correctly. It does not always remember the mechanic as clearly as it remembers the general. But the geometry remains. A convoy sailed under an umbrella of anti-aircraft fire. The umbrella was pointed at the sky. Paul Gunn moved the war to the water.